broadly in the research, we found that there are three main approaches, three main types of decision making that are being used. The first is the one that we're probably most familiar with, which we've termed analytical decision-making, and that's the situation where you basically think, what is it I'm trying to achieve, and then you come up with a variety of options. You know, we could do this, or we could do that, and then you choose between those various options on the basis of as much information and evidence as you can get. The second type is rather different from analytical. It's something that we've called something that is called naturalistic decision-making. And this is something which you see increasingly, or have seen over the last 15, 20 years, increasingly being recognized as important in emergency management. And what naturalistic decision-making does is, rather than identifying a range of different options and trying to balance them up and work out what the very best one is, to come up with the best decision, naturalistic decision-making says, what's the situation I'm in like? Have I been in similar situations to this before? What worked then? And essentially, you pick a single option that you know has worked in the past, rather than trying to balance up a variety of different options. So the basis of naturalistic decision-making is very often experience, in the same way that the basis of analytical decision-making is essentially evidence and information. And the process is very different, because you're either looking at a range of things and deciding between them, or you're taking one thing and trying to make it work. And if it doesn't work, you go back and come up with a new idea. So it's the difference between sort of a range and a sequence. The third element, the third type of decision-making that we've seen is used a lot, is procedures. And that might be a bit surprising that I talk about procedures as a form of decision-making, but they are, because essentially what procedures do is that they make the decisions for you on things which, you know, tend to happen fairly often, and, you know, it's a well-trodden path. You don't have, if you have procedures, operating procedures, you don't have to think, well, what am I going to do now? What are we going to do now? You just do what the procedures say. And so that's the, if you like, a third complementary type. Now, very often in an office, or even an individual, will be using all three different types: the analytical type, the naturalistic type, and the procedural type of decision-making in the same day. I think it would be fair to say that most of the colleagues who we interviewed about decision-making, not all, but most, preferred the analytical type. They felt that that was the right way very often to make a decision, that, you know, what you should do is you should get as much information as possible, balance a range of options, use the information to decide which one is best. And that makes sense, because, you know, this is a method of making decisions that's very, very widely used, and it's used in all sorts of areas of public policy and making big decisions about whether or not to develop infrastructure, build bridges, all of these kind of things. Generally, they use as much evidence as they can, and they go through a variety of options. The problem with doing that in some humanitarian situations is that it does need two things. Firstly, it needs time. It is generally a fairly time-consuming way of doing things. Now, we're not in any way saying that all humanitarian decisions have to be made like that. There are many humanitarian situations are not rapid response. But some decisions do need to be made quickly, and there is a question as to whether analytical decision-making is well suited to those urgent, time-pressurized environments. The second problem that can emerge with analytical decision-making in humanitarian situations is that the information you need to choose between the options might just not be available. And that's partly about information. Obviously, these are often information-poor environments, or there's a lot of information, but it's not the information that you want. It's not useful to making the decision. Or it's about the kind of decision that you're making, because what we saw is quite a lot of humanitarian decisions are not really ones where information will necessarily help you. Evidence is very useful, for example, if you're trying to decide what's the best type of response option here. You can look at the evidence for effectiveness of a variety of nutritional interventions. It's probably much less useful if you're having to make certain kind of staffing decisions. Certain degree of information will be useful, but in the end, deciding whether to hire someone, those kind of things, which is quite a lot of the decision-making load is HR type decisions, even for people in leadership roles. There are limits to the amount of information that you can use. So analytical is a very good approach, but you do need to have time, you need to have information, and you need to be looking at a decision where information is going to be useful.